It is December 1944. The Western Front, a brutal scar of mud, snow, and shattered ambition, was supposed to be a broken line. Instead, it was a meat grinder. The Allied advance, rapid and euphoric after the summer, had stalled. The promise of being home by Christmas had evaporated, replaced by the bitter, numbing cold of the Ardennes forests and the Rhine approaches. Every foot gained was paid for in blood frozen into the soil. The popular narrative of the war's end paints a picture of a collapsing German Wehrmacht. But here, on the fringes of the Siegfried Line, the reality was starkly different. They were fighting like cornered beasts, desperate, tenacious, and terrifyingly efficient. For the young men of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, pushing through the Hurtgen forest and into the borderlands, the war had devolved from a grand crusade into a series of claustrophobic, brutal skirmishes. They were not facing Hitler's elite, but a motley collection of seasoned veterans, shell-shocked teenagers, and aging conscripts, all driven by a shared primal will to survive on their own soil. Private First Class William "Will" Hastings, attached to a forward reconnaissance unit, felt this transition acutely. Will, a quiet farm boy from Iowa, had seen too much. His world had shrunk to the narrow focus of his M1 Garand, the warmth of his field jacket, and the metallic tang of fear. It was a world of black and white, us versus them, life versus death. That binary structure was the only thing keeping him sane. The reconnaissance unit had been tasked with locating a suspected German observation post hidden in a remote, unnamed valley deep behind what the map still claimed were Allied lines. This valley, carved by a freezing creek and dotted with the ruins of a few stone farmhouses, was a pocket of chilling silence amidst the surrounding artillery thunder. It was a place where war's cruel geometry seemed to pause, a visual irony of pastoral peace superimposed over imminent violence. Irony, in this war, was a universal currency. The Allies believed the Wehrmacht was blind and starving. The intelligence reports confirmed the crippling fuel shortages, the attrition of pilots and tank crews. Yet, every time the Allies moved, they were met with surprising, coordinated resistance. What the Allied High Command failed to grasp was the ingenious, almost desperate network of civilian observation and communication the Germans had established in these pockets, a network far more effective than their battered radio systems. It was this network, operating beneath the radar of Allied intelligence, that would turn a simple moment of human kindness into a massive military incident. Will's unit, exhausted and running low on K rations, stopped for a tense, silent break near the edge of the valley. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay. It was here, amongst the wreckage of a collapsed stone barn, that the other world intruded. A small figure, barely more than a shadow in the falling dusk, darted out from the rubble. Not a soldier, a child. Elsa, perhaps 9 years old, her face thin and streaked with dirt, was a ghost of a civilian caught in the conflict's crossfire. She was German. She was an orphan, or at least appeared to be, having been separated from her family during a previous sweep. Her eyes, wide and hollow, held none of the usual fear of the enemy, only the gnawing, cold terror of starvation. For Will, the sight was a momentary, catastrophic failure of the war machine's conditioning. He saw not the enemy, but a child. He fumbled inside his pack, extracting a tin of beef stew and 2 squares of hard tack, precious, high-calorie lifeblood. He approached slowly, hands open, speaking softly in broken, terrible German he hadn't used since boot camp. He shared his rations. The simple act, the breaking of the bread, was a direct violation of standing orders. Fraternization was forbidden, not just for security, but to maintain the psychological distance required to prosecute the war. Will was betting his life, and the security of his unit, on the purity of his intent. The child, Elsa, ate ravenously, her small hand clutching the warm tin. She never spoke, but simply looked up at him with an expression that was either gratitude or perhaps something else, a silent, deep understanding that transcended language and uniform. When she finished, she simply pointed, not toward the German lines, but toward a specific cluster of rocks at the eastern edge of the valley, then turned and vanished back into the shadows of the ruins. Will Hastings felt a strange mixture of warmth and dread. He had satisfied a moral imperative, but he had opened a door to the unknown. The great irony, which Will could not possibly grasp in that freezing moment, was that his small offering of sustenance was not merely a humanitarian gesture. It was a signal, a critical piece of operational intelligence passed unwittingly to a sophisticated, underground network. He had just confirmed the location and vulnerability of his unit. The war machine, so vast and impersonal, often forgets the human element. The simple non-verbal exchange between a soldier and a child, a piece of bread for a silent gesture, would, within hours, trigger a cascade of tactical decisions, transforming this forgotten valley into the focal point of a terrifying, disproportionate military response. The price of that compassion was about to be levied. The unit moved on, Will keeping the small, unsettling incident to himself. The sun was gone, the temperature dropping fast. The men pushed through the thicket, following their original map coordinates. But the mission had fundamentally changed, not by enemy fire, but by a simple act of shared hardship. The question is, how did this single act of kindness become a military crisis? Subscribe and hit the notification bell to find out as we dive into Chapter 2, The Ghost Network and the Code of the Hungry. The next morning broke not with the sound of distant shelling, but with a silence far more ominous. Corporal Ben Thompson, Will's squad leader, was the first to realize the scale of their peril. Thompson, a cynic hardened by North Africa, noticed the lack of birdsong, the absence of the small, natural sounds that even the loudest artillery usually failed to stifle. The air itself felt heavy, coiled. Then came the visual confirmation, stunning in its suddenness and scale. From a high vantage point overlooking the valley where Will had met the girl, Thompson counted them. Over 300 American soldiers. Not just infantry, but a full company, bolstered by heavy weaponry, half-tracks, mortars, and a battery of M10 tank destroyers. They were arrayed across the hillsides, perfectly positioned, closing the vise. The recon unit was not surrounded by the enemy, but by their own side. This staggering, unnecessary mobilization, a company-level response to a 6-man reconnaissance patrol, demanded an answer. What could possibly justify risking this much materiel and manpower for such a low-value target? The answer lay in the very act Will had performed, the seemingly innocent sharing of rations. To understand the reaction, we must first understand the Ghost Network, the intelligence apparatus of desperation employed by the German forces in the autumn of 1944. Cut off from effective air reconnaissance and often plagued by compromised radio security, the Wehrmacht, particularly the remnants of the intelligence branch, the Fremde Heere West, relied increasingly on local human intelligence, civilians. The war had forced the populace into a survivalist posture. In the borderlands, local authorities, often led by fanatics or highly motivated veterans, organized the remaining population into decentralized observation cells. Children, orphans, and the elderly were invaluable because they could move through battle zones with less suspicion than a uniformed soldier. Their currency was not money or loyalty, but survival. The specific Orphan network operating in this sector, later documented by Allied counterintelligence as Project Bienenstock, Project Beehive, used a system of non-verbal signals disguised as the routine of scavenging. A shared American ration, a gesture of charity from the enemy, was not an isolated event. It was a prearranged visual code. In this region, the code, known informally as the Code of the Hungry, centered on 2 variables, the type of food offered and the direction the recipient pointed after receiving it. A piece of hardtack signaled a small, isolated patrol. A specific type of K-ration, like the tinned beef stew Will had shared, signaled a reconnaissance team on a deep penetration mission, a high-value target for a German counterattack. The cruel irony deepens. Elsa, the small girl, was likely not a spy in the classical sense, but a conditioned component of a survival mechanism. She didn't betray Will. She executed her only chance to eat, unknowingly triggering the operational security protocols established by the German rearguard. Her gesture, pointing toward the cluster of rocks, was interpreted by a distant German observer not as guidance, but as confirming the patrol's intended direction of travel, essential for setting up an ambush. The German response was swift. A small, elite squad of Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, veterans, no more than a dozen men, were dispatched to intercept Will's unit. Their objective was not annihilation, but capture, to extract the intelligence the Americans possessed about the Siegfried Line. This is where the narrative takes its first sharp, terrifying turn, a historical wrinkle that saved Will's life and endangered hundreds of others. The German code, while ingenious, was not perfect. A cracked German radio intercept unit, positioned on the Rhine's west bank, managed to pick up the Fallschirmjäger's cryptic communication regarding the bread signal. However, due to Allied jamming and a mistranslation of German field slang, the intercept was catastrophically misinterpreted by the American Signals Intelligence, SIGINT. The signal mentioned Scharfschütze and 6 targets in the valley need Panzerschreck cover. The American analyst mistranslated Scharfschütze, sniper, as 300, based on a confusing overlap with an obsolete code sheet referencing a unit size. More importantly, the mention of targets in the valley was mistakenly linked to a massive, suspected German counterattack force operating under the guise of an ordinary patrol. The SIGINT report that flew up the chain of command that cold morning was terrifying. Confirmed, enemy attack force, estimated 300 men with anti-tank weapons, converging on valuable American reconnaissance asset in Sector M4. This fabricated threat, the 300 Phantom soldiers, triggered the deployment of the entire U.S. Company K, the 300 men, the half-tracks, and the heavy guns that now silently surrounded Will Hastings and his 5 comrades. The American forces had mobilized against a ghost born of a mistranslation and a piece of K-ration stew. The historical irony is breathtaking. Will's human kindness, intended to save a single life, inadvertently created an invisible massive enemy force on the map. Now his own side was deploying overwhelming force not to rescue them, but to engage the non-existent enemy they were believed to be tracking. Ben Thompson's voice was a barely audible rasp in the radio mic as he reported the situation. "We have friendlies on the perimeter, over 300 of them. They are in attack formation. They are surrounding us." The sheer absurdity of the situation, the entire tactical landscape warped by a silent signal and a disastrous piece of intelligence, meant that the stage was now set for a catastrophe, a friendly fire incident of monumental scale, all centered on 6 exhausted men in a silent valley. How could the Americans, believing they were facing 300 enemy troops, be convinced that their own men were not the enemy? And what happened to the actual German squad, the Fallschirmjäger, who were now caught between 2 massive American forces? Stay with us as we unravel this terrifying dilemma in Chapter 3, The Fog of War and the Echo of the Lie. The American Company K, commanded by the methodical, by-the-book Captain Elias Thorne, was not surrounding Will Hastings' unit out of malice or mistake, but out of absolute conviction. Their mission was clear: neutralize a significant German threat and secure the intelligence assets. When Thompson's frantic radio transmission reached Thorne, "We are friendly. We are being surrounded," it was interpreted not as a plea, but as an enemy ruse. The SIGINT report that had traveled up the chain of command was considered ironclad. Captain Thorne was operating on the belief that the patrol they were tracking was either a highly trained German reconnaissance team, possibly wearing captured U.S. uniforms, or worse, a decoy for a major counter-offensive. The psychological weight of the Battle of the Bulge, where German soldiers in U.S. uniforms had caused chaos, made Thorne's suspicion almost a tactical imperative. The moment of maximum suspense arrived at 800 hours. Company K's lead elements, moving silently through the tree line, spotted the 6 men of Will's patrol huddled by the creek. They saw not tired Americans, but 6 men matching the description of the reconnaissance assets to be secured or eliminated. In his position, Ben Thompson stared down the barrel of a U.S. M10 tank destroyer, its 3-inch gun traversing slowly toward his location. He knew the protocol. If they moved, they died. If they stayed, they were captured as spies. Thompson, a man of brutal practicality, made a split-second decision: to break radio silence with a coded message only his divisional command would recognize. He keyed the mic, ignoring Thorne's repeated order to halt. Delta 4 Echo to command. Request confirmation of Operation Big Bird status. I repeat, Big Bird, over. Operation Big Bird was not a real operation. It was a pre-agreed historical dummy code, a fail-safe established by Thompson's division commander, a bird-watching enthusiast, for use only if the unit was in direct danger from friendly fire or capture. The message was meaningless to the enemy, but its unique transmission pattern would flag an alert at divisional headquarters, Div HQ. This desperate move created the crucial delay. Captain Thorne, hearing the cryptic transmission, hesitated. If the patrol were German spies, why would they use such a complex, seemingly meaningless piece of U.S. jargon, which, if intercepted, would compromise nothing? This flicker of doubt was Will and Thompson's only lifeline. The irony intensifies. As the American forces froze, the actual threat materialized. The dozen Fallschirmjäger, led by the experienced Lieutenant Karl Gruber, had been moving toward Will's patrol, confident they were closing on an easy target. Gruber and his men now found themselves trapped between the patrol they sought to capture and the overwhelming stationary bulk of Company K. Gruber, a veteran of Crete and Monte Cassino, immediately understood the geometry of the situation. "It is a trap, but not for us," he muttered to his second in command. "They are not attacking. They are waiting for something. They must believe there is a larger force here." Gruber realized the Americans were reacting to a phantom. His decision was a masterful display of tactical exploitation. To escape the encirclement, he had to use the Americans' own fear against them. Gruber ordered his small squad to employ a classic deceptive maneuver, the ghost flanking maneuver. They positioned themselves in a dense thicket on the ridge opposite Company K. Using their limited ammunition, they began a sustained, rhythmic firing pattern, not aimed at the Americans, but directly at the rocks pointed out by the girl, away from Will's patrol. They focused their fire on different points, interspersed with the distinctive crack of their captured U.S. weapons and the occasional loud report of a Panzerschreck, a German anti-tank weapon. The effect was instantaneous and devastating to the American psyche. Captain Thorne's men heard a coordinated, intense firefight erupting precisely where the SIGINT report had indicated the 300-man force would be positioned. The sound was confusing, echoing strangely in the valley. The fact that the fire was directed away from the immediate area of Will's patrol convinced Thorne. His recon men were bait, and the large German force was making its move. Thorne, now believing he had a full-scale battle on his hands, roared into his radio. "Company K! Engage the enemy at the eastern ridge. Full suppressive fire. Do not let them escape the perimeter." The valley erupted in a cataclysm of friendly fire directed at the actual but tiny German threat. The M10s fired massive HE shells into the thicket. The .50 caliber machine guns on the half-tracks stitched the forest line with lead, and hundreds of men poured rifle and mortar fire into the area. Gruber's men, having executed their diversion, were using the chaos to retreat, melting away through the deep ravines as the American forces unleashed their full might against an empty ridge. The irony now was complete. The 300 Americans were fighting and shooting at the empty space left by a dozen retreating Germans, who were themselves reacting to the mistake created by a single American's compassion. Will and Thompson's patrol was momentarily safe, caught in the eye of a self-generated storm. Div HQ finally confirmed the Big Bird code was a legitimate friendly fire alert, and a desperate order was transmitted to Thorne. "Cease fire! Cease fire! Confirm Patrol Delta 4. Echo is friendly. Do not fire." Captain Thorne, confused and shaken, ordered a hesitant ceasefire. The smell of cordite hung heavy over the valley. He had expended an entire company's worth of ammunition against a phantom force, all while nearly destroying a key American unit. The truth, the full, absurd truth of the miscommunication, the Orphan code, and the tactical deception was about to be pieced together. But the danger wasn't over. Gruber's small unit, though escaping, carried with them a devastating piece of intelligence, the knowledge of the American response time and their overwhelming fear of a large-scale German counterattack. This small group of men, saved by a friendly fire incident, was about to trigger an actual major offensive. Don't go anywhere as we reveal the consequences in Chapter 4, The Price of the Signal. In the immediate aftermath of the friendly fire incident, the valley reeked of wasted gunpowder and bureaucratic panic. Captain Thorne, red-faced and trembling, confronted Thompson and Will. The 300 men of Company K, exhausted and bewildered, were now busy accounting for the thousands of rounds they had poured into an empty piece of woodland. The investigation that followed, involving 2 sets of bewildered officers from Div HQ and SIGINT, was a desperate attempt to reconcile the hard data with the absurd reality. The initial SIGINT report, the one citing 300 men, was immediately flagged as a catastrophic error. The analyst, a nervous young man named Miller, was quickly confined, his flawed translation a grim monument to the perils of wartime communication. However, the question remained: what triggered the initial German response? The Fallschirmjäger squad was real. Their communication about the bread signal was real. It was Will Hastings, the farm boy, who provided the chilling, unexpected key. Under intense questioning, he confessed to the act of compassion, the sharing of the K-ration with the German orphan girl. He described the specific tin of stew and the girl's non-verbal gesture. The counterintelligence officers, led by a colonel named Harrison, were initially dismissive. A child? An orphan? Private. This is the Western Front, not a Christmas story. But Harrison's team had been tracking Project Bienenstock for months. They had observed the strange patterns of food consumption and the movements of non-combatants around known German observation posts. When Will detailed the specific ration, the beef stew, and the silent point toward the rocks, a cold realization dawned. Colonel Harrison explained the terrible truth to the shaken men. You didn't just give a girl a meal, Private. You sent a message. That type of stew, at that time of day, means a deep penetration patrol has been sighted. The child, she wasn't acting out of gratitude. She was following conditioning. Her pointing wasn't thanks. It was the final confirmation of your unit's direction to the German observer who was waiting. The revelation was a devastating psychological blow to Will. His act of humanity, his moral stand against the brutal dehumanization of war, had been co-opted, exploited, and turned into a piece of tactical intelligence that almost cost him his life and wasted the operational readiness of a full company. The line between civilian and combatant, charity and espionage, had been entirely erased. The greatest consequence, however, was still unfolding miles away. Lieutenant Karl Gruber and his 12 Fallschirmjäger reached their command post severely low on ammunition but rich in knowledge. Gruber, highly decorated and tactically brilliant, debriefed his commanding officer, a Major Schmidt. Gruber explained how the American response, an entire company, had been triggered by a phantom threat. Major, he stated, his voice flat with certainty, the Americans are suffering from intelligence blindness. They are utterly convinced that any sighting of our men, even a handful, means a force of 300 or more. Their fear of a major counterattack is their greatest weakness. This was the intelligence goldmine. For weeks, Major Schmidt's division, a battered but still formidable panzer unit, had been planning a limited, spoiling attack, a small thrust intended only to delay the Allied advance, but they had lacked the confidence to commit their scarce resources. Gruber's report changed everything. Schmidt understood that a limited attack, if executed with speed and ferocity, could achieve an exponential effect. The Americans, convinced they were already facing a ghost army of 300, would certainly overreact to a real force of, say, 3,000 men. They would hold back reserves, call for air support, and deploy tank divisions to counter a threat that was strategically manageable for the Germans. This is the ultimate tragic price of the signal. Will's single, compassionate act, misinterpreted by the Allies and exploited by the Axis, provided the exact tactical vulnerability the Germans needed. It shifted the entire calculus of the local war effort. Major Schmidt immediately relayed the information to High Command. The small spoiling attack was upgraded. 3,000 men, a battalion of Panzer IV tanks, and a regiment of motorized infantry were redirected toward this sector. Their objective, the valley. Not because the valley was strategically important, but because the American reaction there had been proven so predictably, massively disproportionate. The German plan was not to take territory, but to induce panic, force a massive commitment of Allied reserves, and buy precious time for the main German defense lines to consolidate. In the valley, Will and Thompson were now part of an extraction team, ordered to sweep the area one last time for clues about the child or the German network. Will was now a different man, his naive view of the conflict shattered. He knew the war was not just about bullets and tanks, but about codes, food, and the terrible unintended consequences of human emotion. As they began their sweep, the radio crackled with a new, terrifying alert, far more serious than the friendly fire incident. Confirmed. Major Axis movement. 3,000 plus. Tanks. Approaching Sector M4. The Valley. The Ghost Army, born of a miscommunication and a piece of bread, had become terrifyingly real. The Battle of the Bread, the unintended conflict triggered by a single soldier, was about to begin. The Valley was about to become a crucible of steel and fire, and Will Hastings, the reluctant protagonist, would find himself right back in the center of the storm. In Chapter 5, we detail the full scope of this unanticipated brutal engagement, the crucible, and the final irony. The sound of the approaching German offensive was not the familiar staccato rhythm of skirmish fire, but a deep, rolling thunder, the unmistakable sound of massed armor and thousands of marching men. Major Schmidt had committed his forces fully, aiming to hit the American command center precisely where they believed the Phantom 300 had been. The American era, their colossal overreaction in Chapter 3, had dictated the geography of the next major battle. The U.S. forces were caught in a horrifying bind. They had initially mobilized Company K to fight an imaginary force. Now they were scrambling to reposition that same company and rush up reserves, primarily elements of the 4th Infantry Division and the attached 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion, to face a very real, very large, and very fast-moving assault. Will Hastings and Thompson's recon patrol, still operating near the initial encounter site, found themselves transformed from intelligence assets to forward observers. Their deep understanding of the valley's terrain, learned during their desperate hours, was now the only advantage the Americans held. The battle, later known only in obscure regimental histories as the engagement at M4 Valley, began with brutal efficiency. Major Schmidt's panzers slammed into the hastily established American lines on the valley's western ridge. The tactical genius of Gruber's intelligence was evident. The Germans exploited the areas where the Americans had wasted their ammunition fighting the Ghost earlier that morning, finding the line thin and disoriented. The American counterattack, spearheaded by the M10 tank destroyers, was furious but reactive. This was not a pre-planned defensive action. It was a desperate reaction to a tactical surprise, gifted to the enemy by a tragic series of errors. The fighting was close, intense, and defined by the cold efficiency of the German attack. The narrative demands a precise technological and strategic detail. The German Panzerfouls, though outclassed by later Allied armor, were used in a shock formation, supported by Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle fire, the world's first true assault rifle, giving the German infantry a massive advantage in close-quarter, tree-line fighting compared to the American M1 Garands. The sheer volume and suppressive fire of the German infantry was overwhelming. Meanwhile, Will Hastings was not fighting the German infantry. He was fighting the consequence of his own actions. Huddled with Thompson in a forward position, providing coordinates, Will saw the small 9-year-old girl, Elsa, again. She was near the edge of the creek, now a deadly neutral zone, collecting what looked like firewood amidst the thunder of the artillery. It was an act of surreal civilian defiance. Will spotted something else, a German soldier, a young, dark-haired man, moving toward the girl's position. It was Lieutenant Gruber. Gruber was not attacking. He was retrieving her. In that single, clear moment, Will understood the real network, the true human complexity. Elsa wasn't just a piece of conditioned intelligence. She was likely someone's younger sibling, daughter, or ward. She was tied to Gruber, not by ideology, but by the fractured family structures of a nation at war. Gruber was performing his own act of human kindness, in the middle of a battle his intelligence report had started. Will's moment of reckoning was now. He had the opportunity to eliminate the man whose intelligence had launched this entire bloody affair. A clean shot. But the girl was there. Thompson, witnessing Will's hesitation, keyed the radio instead. "We have Lieutenant Gruber, East Creek, near the old mill. High-value target. Confirm engagement." The response was immediate and focused. A U.S. artillery battery, directed by Thompson's precise coordinates, launched a barrage. Not a massive bombardment, but a quick, sharp pattern designed to neutralize the target area. Will watched, frozen, as the air was torn apart. The irony was devastating. The moment of simple human compassion had led to the most massive, impersonal military response. The moment of necessary military action was now complicated by a residual, human moral debt. When the smoke cleared, Gruber was gone. Whether he was killed or merely incapacitated was unclear. But the girl, Elsa, was seen running, not toward the German lines, but back into the forest. The strategic consequences were now clear. The battle lasted just 4 brutal hours. The Americans, though badly mauled and shaken by the surprise, eventually repelled Major Schmidt's force. The price was high: 43 American casualties, a dozen vehicles destroyed, and a massive expenditure of ammunition. The Germans, having achieved their goal of inducing an overreaction and tying up Allied resources, retreated in good order, having sustained similar losses. Major Schmidt had achieved his strategic objective. The battle forced the American command to halt their advance in the sector for over a week, dedicating valuable air and armor resources to defensive positions. The single act of kindness, the shared ration, had cost the American advance 7 precious days and over 100 combined casualties. Will Hastings survived the battle. Emerging changed. He was no longer the farm boy who believed in simple black and white. He had seen how a piece of food could become a devastating weapon, how an act of charity could become an engine of war, and how the moral line was always the first casualty of conflict. The story of the valley is a microcosm of the war itself, the terrible human price of strategic miscalculation. But what happened to the men involved? The intelligence analysts, the officers, and the German soldier and the child. We explore their long-term fate and the dark legacy of the incident in Chapter 6, The Scars of the Valley. The official inquiry into the engagement at M4 Valley was a masterpiece of wartime spin. The existence of the friendly fire incident, Chapter 3, was buried, categorized under expended ordnance due to unspecified enemy sabotage. The disastrous SIGINT error was pinned on a low-level operator and classified under compromised code protocols. The truth, the central role of a piece of beef stew and a German orphan, was completely omitted. The records simply stated that the U.S. forces had successfully repelled a massive, preemptive German counterattack force of indeterminate size, preventing a major breakthrough. The war machine had scrubbed its own mistakes. But the men who fought there carried the scars of the true story. Private First Class Will Hastings was granted a field promotion to sergeant and a Bronze Star for his courage under fire as a forward observer. A profound irony, as his actions had caused the fire in the first place. He finished the war, but returned home burdened by a singular, persistent ghost. He never spoke of the incident publicly. In his later life, detailed in post-war veterans' archives, he became an outspoken proponent of post-war aid for European orphans, a silent, lifelong penance for the consequence of his compassion. He never knew the fate of Elsa. Captain Elias Thorne, though criticized internally for his massive over-expenditure of ammunition, was praised for the decisive deployment of resources against the real German attack. He was promoted and finished the war, always believing that his quick thinking had saved his company from a vastly superior German force, never realizing he had originally prepared to fight a ghost of his own creation. His story is a classic example of confirmation bias warping military history. The SIGINT analyst, Miller, was court-martialed and discharged for gross negligence. His career and reputation were ruined, an anonymous casualty of a single, crucial mistake. The system required a scapegoat, and he became the vessel for the disaster he had unwittingly caused. On the German side, the fate of Lieutenant Karl Gruber remained uncertain. The American intelligence records, based on prisoner interrogations in the following weeks, suggest he was severely wounded in the artillery barrage near the creek. He may have been recovered by retreating German forces, or may have died near the mill. His legacy, however, was concrete. His single, accurate piece of intelligence enabled one of the last successful local spoiling attacks of the Western Front. And what of Elsa, the German orphan girl? The counterintelligence investigation never fully identified her, concluding she was one of dozens of non-combatants exploited by the Project Bienenstock network. But a chilling, post-war footnote, discovered in an obscure Bavarian archive, sheds a sliver of light. A small, local orphanage registry from 1946 records the entry of a 9-year-old girl named Elsa, with no surname, suffering from severe shell shock and malnutrition. The registry noted a peculiar habit. She would refuse to eat canned beef stew. The historical significance of the engagement at M4 Valley is profound, precisely because it was intentionally erased from the popular record. It is a perfect microcosm of the complexities of modern industrialized warfare. 1. The over-reliance on technology. The entire crisis was initiated not by observation, but by a radio intercept that was mistranslated. Allied forces had become so reliant on the superior SIGINT capability that they overrode common sense and visual confirmation. 2. The power of civilian resistance. The Project Bienenstock network demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of a decentralized, non-combatant intelligence system fueled by survival instincts. A single simple signal became more strategically impactful than a regiment of frontline scouts. 3. The contradiction of compassion. Will Hastings's story is the ultimate example of the moral impossibility of the modern soldier. In a total war, where every enemy citizen is a potential vector of intelligence, the simplest act of human kindness can be the ultimate act of operational failure. The valley itself became a silent, grim memorial. For years after the war, local farmers continued to find brass casings, shrapnel, and unexploded ordnance, the physical residue of a massive battle that, by all official accounts, should never have been fought. It remains a testament to the unintended power of a simple, shared ration in a world that had forgotten how to share anything. But the questions remain. Did the Americans ever realize the full absurdity of their actions? Was there a deeper level of infiltration that the counterintelligence missed? And what lessons did the post-war military establishment draw from the tragedy of the bread signal? We turn now to the strategic aftermath and the enduring legacy in Chapter 7, the doctrine of distrust. The lessons learned from the M4 Valley incident, though officially suppressed, filtered into the highest echelons of military planning, particularly within the nascent Cold War intelligence community. The event was not seen as a singular localized tragedy, but as a chilling blueprint for future espionage and subversion. The key takeaway was codified informally as the doctrine of distrust, a psychological and operational imperative that stated, in any theater of conflict, any unexpected act of kindness or charity from the local populace, particularly children, must be treated as a potential operational trigger. This doctrine became a foundational element of counterinsurgency warfare and psychological operations, PSYOPS, for decades to follow, influencing U.S. military strategy in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The single piece of bread Will Hastings offered had been transformed into a global military policy. The flaws in the SIGINT analysis led to massive investment and reform in the American signals intelligence apparatus. A new, complex system of triple authentication and redundancy checks for critical enemy communications was implemented. The lesson learned was that human fallibility in translation, when paired with high-volume, rapid communication, could be more dangerous than enemy deception. The military began investing heavily in early forms of automated pattern recognition to eliminate the Miller error.
Will Hastings, haunted by the valley, found peace only by dedicating himself to the memory of the common soldier, advocating for better post-war care. In the 1970s, a retired U.S. colonel, formerly with the 4th Infantry Division, wrote a memoir that briefly referenced the M4 Valley confusion, hinting at a massive overreaction and a silly mistake involving a K ration and a child. This fleeting reference was the only public acknowledgement of the root cause of the battle.
For the veteran members of Company K, the battle became a source of grim, dark humor. They had fought 3,000 men who should have been 12, after preparing to fight 300 men who didn't exist. They were the men who fought the Ghost Army, an army created by a simple, broken human connection. Decades later, a German historian, researching the last-ditch counterattacks of the Wehrmacht, uncovered Major Schmidt's after-action report on the M4 engagement. In it, Schmidt credited the success of the attack not to military might, but to an unforeseen but valuable intelligence gift that revealed the American forces' unwarranted psychological fear of a large-scale German presence. He attributed the intelligence to a Fallschirmjäger officer who had recovered crucial data from a neutralized American asset. The report never mentioned the child. It never mentioned the food. It merely confirmed the cold strategic truth. Will Hastings' compassion was the key intelligence asset of the German operation. The story of the bread and the valley is not about heroes or villains. It is a lesson in the thermodynamics of war. Every action, no matter how small or morally pure, has an equal and opposite reaction, and the most dangerous weapon of all is a simple, unverified piece of information. The war machine, having destroyed the valley, eventually destroyed the memory of the kindness that caused it, leaving behind only the cold, factual evidence of blood and steel. To truly understand the psychological warfare waged in the shadows of World War II, we must explore the enduring methods of espionage and counterintelligence that defined the era. If you found this historical deep dive compelling, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. Your support ensures we can continue to bring these critical, untold stories of human experience and military strategy to light. The M4 Valley incident, a perfect storm of humanitarian impulse, coded intelligence, and catastrophic miscommunication, serves as a powerful, uncomfortable lens through which to view the end of the Second World War. It strips away the myth of the perfectly oiled war machine and exposes the fallibility of man and machine alike. The ultimate conclusion of this historical deep dive is not a simple condemnation of either side, but a profound observation on the nature of total conflict. The distinction between the battlefield and the home front, the combatant and the civilian, vanished in the snows of 1944. Elsa, the German orphan, embodied the ultimate fusion of tragedy and utility. Her utility, the ability to act as a crucial link in a desperate German intelligence network, sprang directly from her tragedy, her hunger, and her vulnerability. The moment Will Hastings saw a human being, the war machine saw an opportunity. This lesson defined the post-war era, leading to the development of sophisticated intelligence doctrine, centered on neutralizing civilian-based observation and communication in occupied territories. A detailed post-analysis confirms the staggering cost of the error. Company K fired over 30,000 rounds of small arms fire and 45 high-explosive tank shells against a ghost target, the Phantom 300, before the true German force arrived. This was a tactical waste equivalent to a full day's combat readiness for the company, all for an engagement against a squad of 12 men. The material cost of the friendly fire incident alone was greater than the cost of the actual German counterattack. The human cost, the 7 days of delay in the crucial advance toward the Rhine, was priceless. Will Hastings had won a moral victory in his soul. He had refused to let the brutal cynicism of war extinguish his humanity. But on the tactical map, he had committed a catastrophic blunder. The war machine had punished him for his virtue, not by death, but by turning his act into an engine of death for others. His story is a chilling reminder that in total war, the highest moral good often leads to the worst strategic consequence. The valley itself, once a stage for human kindness, became a symbol of strategic distrust. The story was never meant to be told, as it undermined the narrative of Allied infallibility and technological superiority. But the veterans knew. They knew that a small tin of beef stew, a 9-year-old girl, and a terrible mistranslation almost changed the course of a local battle, proving that the human element, its flaws, its compassion, and its capacity for error, remains the most unpredictable and powerful factor in the geometry of conflict. The valley today is silent, overgrown, its scars hidden by decades of natural recovery. But the shadow of the bread and the valley endures in every intelligence manual and every operational doctrine that mandates suspicion over sympathy. The war ended, but the lesson, the unintended price of a single act of kindness, never did.